Hello. So it is late November, and I know that a lot of PhD applications are due December 1st or thereabouts. That's the deadline for our program and a lot of other ones that I'm familiar with. So I am here for moral support and to help you through the last minute push and answer questions if I can. Um, of course, you're welcome to ask questions about other things as well, but I am assuming that the vast majority of stuff that folks would like to know at this point is about PhD applications. And before I get started, as always, this is all based on my own experience and my opinions, and my experience is mostly relevant to STEM and social science disciplines and programs in the United States. So I will try to surface when I am more sure about answers to things than others. So as always, I'm just going to have a look at the questions in the order that they come in. If I accidentally skip your question, feel free to ask it again. Sometimes it scrolls through quickly and it's easy for me to miss things. All right, well, let's go. um, so, someone is saying that they decided to apply late, but that some schools require or encourage contacting faculty before applications. And so they're wondering if it would look bad to reach out to faculty this week if the deadline is December 1st. This is a tough one in part because if you're looking at programs in the United States, it's a holiday. So, for me personally, I am trying because technically like our campus is closed the entire next week. I am personally, for my own mental health, going to try to not work much next week, which means that it's actually quite likely that I will not respond to emails that are not urgent next week. That said, I don't necessarily think that it's bad. I just think that it might not be as helpful for you at this point. So for those of you who haven't seen my video about contacting PhD advisors, I kind of describe it as being helpful for you in terms of a sort of fact-finding mission, as opposed to, at least in most of my experience and in other sorts of things that I'm familiar with, as opposed to being a requirement, for the application process. Um, so I don't necessarily think that it looks bad. Um, I just I wouldn't necessarily expect that you would get a response before the deadline. And so with that in mind, even more so than usual, sort of don't take it personally. And if you do reach out to faculty now, you might mention, I'm aware that we're quite close to the deadline. Please don't feel obligated to respond right away. I'd still be happy to talk to you, after I've submitted my application, if you would be interested in that, or something like that. All right, let's see. Next question. So an international student who's applying for PhD programs in Spanish and Portuguese. Many of the deadlines are December 31st. In the American system, what is better? Send the application weeks in advance or wait until the last day with the possibility of adding a new article to your CV? Okay, so here's an example of where I can only speak from my own experience, but at least in my program, we do not look at applications until after the deadline. Like, I don't know what the point would be. um, and actually, I had someone ask me this specific question, like, would it look bad if they applied right by the deadline? And I'll be honest, in our program, and I am the person, well, with some admin assistance now, which is wonderful, who is looking at all of the applications when they come in. I'm not reading them all closely personally, but I see every application, and it has never even occurred to me to look and see when it was submitted. Like, that seems completely irrelevant to me. So I can just tell you from my experience, I don't see why that would matter at all. But of course, I can't promise you that some programs aren't doing things differently. Um, Wondering if the admissions committee doesn't read your application if there are only two recommendation letters instead of three. I'm afraid I don't know the answer to this question. Some programs, especially that get a large number of applications, might not look at applications until they are marked as complete, which would mean that they have all of the pieces. Um, so I don't know. Um, for our program, I tend to pull applications even if they're listed as incomplete, which might mean they're missing a letter or they're missing GRE scores or they're something. And we can do that in part because we don't get like a massive number of applications, and so going back and looking later to see if they've been completed is not like a huge burden. But I can see how like programs where their admissions process has a lot of admin support, where someone who's not the admissions committee or not faculty are doing things like pulling applications and putting together data and that sort of thing, it is possible they might not pull them until they're complete. And I'm also not sure if here you're asking, what if you didn't ask three people? Like, I don't know if you're asking, what if one of my letter writers doesn't get their letter in on time, or if you're asking, I only asked two people instead of three. The second one I think is more of a problem. So I can't say for sure how different programs might handle this, but I think that if there is a requirement of an application, whether that's you have to give us GRE scores, or you have to write a statement of purpose, or you have to have 3 recommenders, I recommend not going against those requirements. Again, different programs will consider these things, more important versus others. Some programs might be more willing to have exceptions than others. But if there's something that that you're doing that's against their requirements, I might recommend asking, like emailing and saying, will my application be considered if I only have 2 recommenders? So that's the issue where you don't have enough. If you're worried about your recommenders like not getting their letters in by the deadline, again, I don't know how other programs handle this, but I personally tend to expect that some folks might not get them in like right by the deadline. I mean, it's really, it's better, definitely better. But at least in my experience, applications might already go ahead and be looked at before you get those letters. That said, if, depending on how quickly it happens and when your application comes up in the stack, if you're missing a letter that would have been amazing and made your application so much better, there's a possibility that if your application is reviewed before that letter comes in, it might not get re-reviewed depending on how the process goes. I don't know. So I guess my answer to this question, depending on which of those situations you're about, was that it's certainly better to have all of them, but it might not necessarily be like a deal breaker. Someone said thank you. You're welcome. Do you think suggesting a research topic when contacting faculty is appropriate? Saw it's okay in humanities, but not sure about STEM. Okay, so here's also something where there's a little bit of difference, not only in different kinds of programs, but in different countries. So in the US, it is less common for part of a PhD application to be an actual research proposal. However, in some other countries, notably I'm thinking about the UK, in STEM disciplines, my understanding is that you submit a separate research proposal as part of your application. That's not something I can give you advice on. I just don't know much about what that means or how that works or how they're evaluated. So I'm just that caveat. I mean, research. So one question is like, what do you mean by a research topic? Okay, so and you're talking about contacting faculty. It's also interestingly, for the way you've worded your question here, is actually, I thought, and I could be wrong about this, more common to contact faculty in STEM than in humanities, like before an application. But also could be different in different humanities disciplines. So one question is like, what do you mean by research topic? Because like if someone reaches out to me, like because they're applying to the program and they think I might be an appropriate advisor and they're trying to get more information or find out what I'm doing or ask questions or whatever, it would be strange to me if they don't tell me why they're reaching out to me. And so like I would expect if someone emails me, they're like, I'm really interested in applying to your program. I'm really interested in your work because I also want to study technology ethics, or social media privacy or online communities for marginalized groups, or I don't know, insert something that I do. So, in a way, that's a research topic. I think it might be a little bit strange to email a prospective faculty, like a prospective advisor, and say, hello, I'm applying to your PhD program. This is what I want my dissertation to be about. I'm going to do 3 studies, and it's going to be this one. This that would be a little strange, I think. And I say this in part because you're probably wrong. Like, I don't know that I've ever known a single PhD student who whatever they said they wanted to do in their statement of purpose was exactly what they ended up doing in their in their PhD. So kind of like, my advice in my statement of purpose video, I suggest sort of thinking, even if you think you know exactly what you want to do from day one, maybe think about like, what is that? What is the broader version of that? What is that an example of? So I don't know if that completely answered your question, but yes, topic, maybe not like specific. And again, this might be different in different disciplines. So I'm not completely sure I know the answer to this question, but I think that, if you're thinking about sort of options, then a sort of middle ground would be topic, but not project, maybe. Scrolling back up, it keeps like scrolling down when I'm in the middle of reading stuff. Recommendations on how to talk about ways you're fit for a specific program or school other than mentioning specific faculty. So I hope you mean in addition to instead of because that is the easiest and most common way to do that. And even if you come up with something else, it's going to be weird again, a little bit discipline specific, but often unusual to not name specific faculty. But if you're thinking about other things like, I mean, like the thing is like faculty are indicative of the kind of research that's happening in the department, right? So there might be ways that you could talk about that without mentioning specific faculty. Maybe there are like centers at that university or in that department that are like specific kinds of things. Like, okay, so for example, at my university, there's like a few different sort of centers that faculty in our department and students in our department are sometimes sort of affiliated with. Like, one is there's this like tech law center that's on top of the law school, and I'm affiliated with it. And so I guess if a student was interested in doing law related research, they, in addition to mentioning me, they might also say, I also see that like the Silicon Flatiron Center for Law and Technology is also at this university, and I would be really involved. So, if you're willing to sort of do that kind of deep dive research too, I think that's great. But make sure that you're not. I mean, this is a little bit tricky, but you want to make sure that you don't lean too heavily on stuff that's not directly related to that program or that department, because you don't want to make it seem like you should be applying to another department instead. Like, I had someone recently ask me questions about mentioning faculty outside the department. And I think that can be good, but that can be good in terms of like, I'm really interested in sort of interdisciplinary collaborations, but you would only want to do that if you also mention faculty in that department, because you don't want to make it like, if someone applied to our program and the only faculty they mentioned in their letter were faculty in the computer science department, which is not my department, I'm in information science. Even if they were faculty who work very closely with our department, I would read that and say, I wonder why they're not applying to computer science instead. So, if that's going to be a thing, then just sort of make sure that you're thinking about how to address that. And that, anyway, I hope that was helpful, but definitely mention specific faculty too. Let's see. Someone is already a TA and an instructor in the place where you'd like to be admitted. And some people like you versus dislike you. Do you have a chance? I have absolutely no idea. There's absolutely no way I could answer this question. And I don't even know sort of where to start. So general sort of advice about how nothing in your application is a deal breaker, I guess. Um, some applications are requesting a personal statement in addition to SOP. Some are asking for diversity statements. Are these similar or different? Okay, so this is a good question, and I was actually thinking recently that like maybe, and maybe maybe for next year, I'll do a little research and see if I can make a video about the difference between a statement of purpose and a personal statement and a statement of like diversity statement. Um, I'll be honest, I don't actually know what a personal statement looks like for a PhD program because I've we don't have one in our department. I don't know other like I just don't know anything about them because I don't have any experience with that. Um, it would seem weird to me to have all three, though. So I wonder if a personal statement could be very similar to a diversity. So a diversity statement, so often there's a very specific prompt, and it will usually say something like, how do your personal experiences impact it? Like that's kind of what a personal statement is too. Is like how do you like you as a person sort of influencing why you want to get a PhD or what you want to do, et cetera. Which, if you're not also doing a personal statement, you could put a little bit of that in your statement of purpose. Diversity statements often have a prompt like, how would you contribute to diversity? Or how does diversity matter to you? Or these sorts of things. And again, we don't have one of these in our program. I can imagine ways that they might be useful, though. One is that it sort of prompts you to think about your positionality. This doesn't mean that you're going to do research that somehow can directly contributes to diversity, though if that's what you have in mind, that's certainly something that you can write about. There might be something about your background or personal experience, something like being part of a group that is underrepresented in this field, being a first gen student, um, you know, having certain challenges, a disability, etc. These are the kinds of things that you can talk about only if you're comfortable with that. But also, if you're watching this and you're like, I'm trying to think of who would not fall into these categories. I'm like a white cis man whose parents both have PhDs, and it's something like that. Like, what can I possibly say? And just because you don't think that like you as like your identity is somehow like contributing to diversity, what are you going to do? What do you care about? Um, so I if you have to write a diversity statement and you feel like you don't have anything sort of from your personal experience that's relevant, you can talk about supporting students in teaching, for example, or being part of a diverse research group, or this sort of thing. So again, this isn't something that I know a lot about. um, I might try to find out a little bit more, maybe talk to some people who have either one of these kinds of statements in their department. But I guess the answer is that it's more personal and less about research. You have 3 referees, and should you add an extra advisor as your 4th referee? My question, I think, here is, do they ask for 4? Is it like you have to give us 3, but you can give us 4? So let me answer this a couple of different ways. So if the application says submit this many letters, let's say 3, then you should give 3. You should not give 4 because it doesn't ask for 4, and the 4th might not be read, or you might not even be able to submit 4. If it says submit at least 3, but you can submit 4, then I think the question is, is that 4th one going to be good? Is it going to make your application better? And I can't answer that for you. Is it important to have letters of rec from the last university that you attended? Could it be a person you conducted your research with? Okay. Is it important to have LORs from your university you last attended? I don't know that it necessarily matters where someone's from. You should get the letter writers that are going to be the best letters and the most relevant. So from the person you conducted your research with. This, yeah, so my answer is like very strongly yes to this, but I wonder why I'm wondering why you might think that wouldn't be appropriate. So like, was it not research that you think is relevant, or is it someone that you don't think is going to write you a long or a good letter? Anyway, I have a whole video about like sort of who, in my opinion, who I think makes the best letters of rec. But I think the answer to this is yes, the person you conducted research with is probably the best person to write your letter. Will not submitting a GRE negative impact applications? Okay, so let's do the GRE conversation. A lot of programs now are either not requiring GREs, which would either mean we don't accept them or they are optional. If they don't accept them, well, then your decision's easy. You do not submit a GRE. If they are optional, a lot of people wonder if not submitting them will look bad. I guess the assumption is like, if I don't submit a GRE score, they're going to assume that I took it and my score was bad, and that's why I didn't accept it. Now, general caveat that I don't know about how any other people evaluate programs, people evaluate applications, but in my opinion, that would be like I almost used profanity. That would that would be really inappropriate for any admissions committee to look badly on not submitting a GRE score. And the reason is because one of the reasons that GRE scores are now being dropped or being optional is because they cost money. It costs money to take the GRE. So, and to send scores to places. So if you don't have a GRE score, sure, that could mean that you decided to take it and your score was bad, but it could also mean you don't have money, so you decided not to take it. And so that it would be completely inappropriate to consider not submitting GRE scores as a poor signal. That said, I can't promise you that no one thinks that way. I can only tell you that I would certainly not think that way. Can you talk about a very specific question to me? Can I talk about how I leveraged my JD in my PhD application? Well, I barely remember my statement of purpose. So the reason that I decided to get a PhD after so a JD is a law degree. The reason that I decided to get a JD, the reason I decided to get a PhD after I finished law school, or rather while I was finishing law school, was because I wanted to study the intersection of law and technology. I was frustrated by the lack of empiricism in legal scholarship. I thought that this was an understudied area that was sort of ripe for research, and that I would be a unique person to do that. And that's all. I mean, that's all still true. Like, there's not a lot of like research at the intersection of law and HCI. Like, half of it's mine. And so that's what I wrote about in my statement of purpose, because that's why I wanted to get a PhD. So yeah. So it was very relevant that I had a law degree and that I had very relevant experience, in the same way that if I don't know, let's say you had an undergrad degree in molecular biology, and you wanted to apply to computer science PhD programs because you wanted to do, computational biology work, then obviously you'd be talking a lot about this undergrad degree in molecular biology. So it was exactly the same thing. Should the reference paper be on branded university or a blank file? So I think you're asking, when someone writes you a letter of recommendation, should they put it on letterhead? And I think the answer I think is they usually do. Usually when I see letters of recommendation, they're on letterhead, but they don't have to be. And I don't think that would be somehow a bad thing if it wasn't. Can your co-author who's a PhD candidate provide a reference? Okay, actually, this is a really good question. So, yes, and I think that could be fine, but I will say it I do think it's better if the letter would or could be just as good to have it from like the PI and stuff. Okay, if there's a PI. So a common thing is that like if you're say an undergrad or a master's student and you're working, with a PhD student and like you say co-author, so like you're an author in a published paper. Often there's a faculty member who is an author on that paper as well, or who's like the PI of the lab or whatever. Um, it would probably be better coming from them, sort of all things being equal. But if you can't get a letter from them or they can't write it because they literally don't know anything about you and aren't willing to find out, then I think you should get the PhD student to write it. Now, the way that this has happened with me before, like I've written, and actually, I think when I was a PhD student, actually, yes, when I was a PhD student, there was a student who was working directly under me, and my advisor wrote a letter, but asked me what things they should say about them, and then they mentioned in the letter that they'd been directly working with me, and that this information was coming in part through me. So I think that would be ideal if you could do that. But again, if they're not going to write you a letter, the faculty member, or they're going to write a letter that's not going to be good, then I would say get the PhD student to write it instead. And again, I can't really. Also, I don't know how this might be like I don't know, there might be people who would like just throw a letter from a PhD student out the window. I think that would be inappropriate, but sometimes things are more elitist than I tend to assume. I'm too optimistic. Confused about including the professor's name in your statement of purpose, whose lab you're interested in. Do you have to include his name only or more? Okay, so here's my question for you. Are you literally only interested in working with this person to the point where if you were admitted into this program and were asked to work with someone else, you would not go there? If that's not true, definitely mention more people. If that is true, I think it's up to you. You could still do that, but unless it's like an incredibly small department where people are doing super, super different things, there's probably someone else there who at least would like, if there really is no one else that you think is relevant to you at all, I'd be like, how are you going to have a committee? So, again, if they're literally the only person you have any interest in working with at all, I guess it could be okay to only mention them. But, if they're part of a broader area, I mean, you don't have to, like, you can emphasize someone. Like, you can spend 3 sentences talking about someone and then say, and I also think, I also think that these other things are, so I can't, it kind of depends on your situation. Yeah. In the UK, applying for some US institutions, how would you suggest structuring a statement of purpose in terms of what should come first? I mean, I can't really answer this because everyone's narrative is going to be so different. Um, I mean, so I guess I tend to see them a little bit like a funnel where like they start off broad and then get more narrow, because usually the very last thing is the why this program is usually like if I look at any given statement of purpose, I'm probably going to see names of professors in like the last 2 paragraphs. But that said, I wouldn't even consider that like a thing you always have to do. So yeah, it tends to start like big picture, then maybe go into like your experience, and then why this program sort of towards the end. But it really depends on the narrative and what makes sense. In a research project, you're currently preparing a manuscript in which you are the first author. Congratulations, but it won't be published or archived by the app deadlines. Okay, let me take this as an opportunity to address an FAQ in case this comes up as well. Because I think this is related to the whole like, do you have to have publications already in order to be admitted into a PhD program? And in case you haven't heard me talk about this at length before, the answer is no, or at least should be no. Um, so a way that I've talked about this before is that it's not the publication that's the important thing. It's not like the fact that something is published that is what makes this good. Like a good application. It's what you did. It's like the experience, like the research. What did you do? If it happens to have already gotten to the point where it's published, like that's awesome. But to me, it's like if it hasn't gotten to that point yet, it's still just as good. And so you should be talking about what it is that you did, right? And so talk about what you did, and then you can say like, and this is currently a manuscript that we're planning to submit. You can even say where you're planning to submit it to if you think like that could be relevant. But I think that that's completely fine. Should a writing sample for a PhD program be single or double spaced? I don't think it matters. And I don't so I at least for our program, I don't when it's that we have I think it's an optional writing sample actually. And I don't think it says like a number of pages or anything. So I think the answer is it doesn't matter unless they give you a page limit or something like that. Do applicants from foreign countries have less chance to be invited for an interview? Oh, okay, this is a good. I was just ready to I was ready to say international applicants are treated exactly the same as domestic applicants, which is true in the application process. It is possible, depending on the program and finances and that sort of thing, that if you're not in the country where you're applying, you might not be invited to an in-person like open house or interview thing. That is possible. That said, I don't the reason for that is because it's incredibly expensive to fly people to another country. It doesn't have anything to do with your chances of being admitted. And typically when that happens, you'd have like, Zoom. Everyone's been doing Zoom interviews for the past 2 years anyway. So I'm not sure which of those you were asking. So there is some chance that if, and also like in some programs, people are flown out. Also in some programs, people are not flown out at all. So don't think that's weird. Sometimes they're flown out before people are admitted, and sometimes they're flown out after you're admitted. And if it's after you're admitted, it doesn't matter anyway. It's for you deciding where to go. So the answer to this is that it might impact whether you are flown out somewhere, but it should not impact your application at all. And if it's an interview, my assumption is that there would be, a Zoom interview or whatever instead. I think that's what you were asking. Does mentioning one faculty name in the statement of purpose, is that bad because you never know if they're going to have students that year? But the faculty you have is going to have students. So how will that affect? So I might have answered part of this a minute ago when I was answering a different question, but let me just say a little bit more about this. There are some programs and art like mine to some extent, but even worse, like say 3 years ago. My program is very small. We have like 12 or 13 faculty in the whole department. And also we do very different kinds of things. And so, it is possible that someone might apply to our program wanting to work with someone where it seriously is like that one person who would be appropriate for them to work with. That said, even in that case, I can't think of a situation in which there isn't someone else who is relevant to what you're interested in. I'll give the same advice I gave before, which is that if there's literally no one else there that you would absolutely not go there if you couldn't work with this person, then maybe that's a slightly different situation. But I still think that, mentioning how your interest, like what mentioning what you might get out of interacting with other faculty in that department can still only be good. Um, like for example, we've had students apply to our program where like they're super, super computational people. Like I would never be their advisor because I like mostly do qualitative work. And they want to like build things and do machine learning and I've had students who applied to our program mention me in their statement of purpose, not because they think I'm going to be their advisor. They're like, I also think that the kind of work that I do would really benefit from, ethical perspectives, as might be offered by Dr. Fiesler. I think that's really nice. It shows that you did your research. It shows that you're thinking about who else in the department you might interact with. And so I can only see that as being a positive thing. Now I've had people ask me before, like, might a faculty member be offended, like, if you've mentioned more than one and again, I don't know if, like, there are people out there who are like this or if there are different norms in other disciplines about how this works. That seems like it would be weird to me. But this might be a case where you might wanna, like, ask someone in your discipline sort of what's normal there. I can't imagine, like, being offended because someone mentioned someone else besides me, but, but I guess you never know. What main problems and complicating things could have applicants who are from Western or Eastern Europe? Like in the application, nothing. I mean, the challenge that I think international students have right now is visas, but that shouldn't be relevant to the application process at all. So I can't. I again, in my experience, international applicants are treated exactly the same as domestic applicants in the application process. Um, so someone says there's a priority deadline and a later one. Is it all right to submit by the later date? Ooh, I've never seen this before. I mean, I've seen this for like job application, like faculty job applications before, but not for PhD applications. I, s- I'm, s- I, so I don't actually want to give an answer to this because I really don't know. I mean, usually what a priority deadline means is that like this is when we're going to start looking at applications. Um, but it might mean they're doing like if they're doing rolling acceptances, then I would say try to get it in as soon as possible. But I have no idea of knowing whether that's the case. I mean, you could always ask, especially because you say here like your scores are gonna be later. So you might just email them and say, hey, my application is done. I could submit it by the priority deadline, but my scores won't be here yet. So should I wait? And they might just give you an answer. When making a CV, oh, and it just scrolled me away again. Okay, just a second. While making a CV for a PhD application, can you give me some key points such as number of pages, spacing, etc.? So I have a whole YouTube video about CVs. Um, but it's not just about PhD. It's sort of generally about CVs. The one of the things I'll tell you about that video is like make sure you click on the part where it's like look at my old CV because like I'm scrolling through my CV right now to show it as an example. And this is me as like a professor up for tenure. Like your CV as a PhD student is going to have like nothing on it, or as a PhD applicant. So number of pages, spacing doesn't, I mean, make it look nice, but there's no, things to include anything that's relevant and whatever, like my main advice in that video is like structure your CV in a way that makes you look good. So if you happen to be, someone who like has publications already, then like highlight that. If you're someone who has like really interesting work experience, then highlight that. If you're someone who like you don't really have these things yet and you're just like an undergrad who has like a little bit of research experience and like make a section for research experience even if it doesn't have publications. If you're someone who has a super interesting educational thing, like there isn't a there aren't rules for CVs. So you should structure it and put the information on it that will make you look good. In the UK, STEM subjects, you typically apply to a research project where you propose your own research project. Yes. So, to my point earlier about how programs in the UK are a bit different. Also, in the UK, you tend to apply to like you'll often see like um, calls for new PhD students for particular projects. And that's just a totally different way of doing it that I'm just not that familiar with. I think there are some folks here on YouTube though that have more experience with UK-based PhD programs and also give advice, so you should check them out. How do you end an SOP because the university you're targeting have a good program? Yeah, so I think I said this before, but like the most common way I see ending an SOP is why this particular program, because it tends to look a little bit like a funnel. Plus, then that makes it easier because when you're targeting your statement of purpose to different programs, you can just change like the last two paragraphs and everything else can be the same. What should the format of a paper citation in a CV? Doesn't matter. I mean, I would just say whatever is the most common format in your field, right? So, but even then, I don't think it matters. Yeah, I don't think it matters. Completed a PhD. You've completed a PhD already in India and want to pursue another one to gain more insight. Please advise. I that's a little too broad. I don't know that I have any specific advice. It's the same advice that I would give anyone else applying for a PhD program, I guess. If you do a PhD in Europe, will you get a job in the US? I'm going to assume you mean can and not will, in which case, yes, sure. People with PhDs from other countries get jobs in the US all the time. Does year gaps matter when applying for PhDs? I don't tend to think so. I don't think so. I don't really see why it would. I mean, it's something that like if it's unclear what the gap is, you might get questions about it in an interview or something. But I don't see why that would matter. Email the potential PhD advisor and he responded with a scholarship recommendation. But no replies to subsequent emails. Can it affect your PhD admission? Probably not. I mean, or rather, I'll give you the same answer that I give to anyone who says they're not getting responses when reaching out to potential advisors, which is like, don't take it personally. It might mean nothing. So same thing. Don't take it personally, and it might mean nothing. It might mean that they are like me and totally underwater and just missing emails sometimes. You never know. Before your master's, GPA is not that great, but you have research experience, and research collides with the professor working in a very good university. Is there a chance of getting in? Should you apply there or not? So I'll give a sort of general answer to a lot of this, which is like, do you have a chance in any particular place with any particular stats is not a question that I can answer. And just, also just the general thing that like anything in an application should not be a complete deal breaker. Strengths can always make up for weaknesses. So, but I can't tell you whether you have a chance of getting into any particular place and whether you should apply there. Apply to a PhD program. At my university, how many applications are received and how many are admitted, and are admitted students usually interviewed? I don't know. I don't know if you mean my program. I also don't think that this is a particularly useful thing to know, like what acceptance rates are. Because it doesn't really affect anything except what I can tell you is that every application is considered, and we don't actually do interviews at least in my program. And I don't know if other program, I don't know if interviews is like a common thing. I mean, sometimes we'll have chats with students once applications come in to get more information. But we don't do formal interviews. And actually, like my video about PhD interviews is like, I think starts with me saying, like, I don't know what formal interviews are like, but this is what you all call them. So I'm going to call them this too. And here are the kinds of things that you want to say when you're talking to a faculty member at a program that you've applied to. Applied for a oops. Oh, something weird just happened. Oh, here we go. Okay. Applied for a PhD position for 2 months now. After your reference responses, they contacted you to ask if you have any criminal convictions. Huh. Um, so, um, so you applied 2 months ago and haven't heard anything back yet. Well, one question I might have is like, when was the deadline? Because if you submitted early, they might not be looking at applications really until whenever the deadline was. But the question of like, can you follow? I mean, sure. Like you can, especially if there's a reason you need to know. And a reason you might need to know eventually, it's like, admissions decisions start coming out at all kinds of different times, usually like in the spring, spring / like early next year, depending on the deadlines. And so you might start hearing acceptances from places when you haven't heard from other places. And then you might need to know, like, should I go to this other place? And so it's fine to like email a program and ask, if they know when decisions will be made. As long as you ask politely, and if they tell you no, you're like, all right, I will wait. You have a BSc and don't have research experience, but interested in a PhD. Finding it hard to write a convincing email to a prof. So the whole sort of like, I don't have explicit research experience yet. Not a deal breaker. I have PhD advisees who didn't have what I would consider sort of formal research experience before they came into our program. So I think the thing that you should be clear is that you understand sort of what research is in your field. You know that that's what you want to do. You know the kinds of things that you're interested in. And you might also consider whether there are things that you did for like classes that were sort of research-like for your discipline. Do I have any idea what the, the person who's asking me about my university, I don't know if you're asking me about my program specifically or like my university in general. But one thing I'll say is like, what are acceptance rates like at any particular university? I'm going to guess is completely different for different programs. So no way to answer that question. And I have no idea how competitive it is compared to other universities. What is the deadline to apply for a PhD in CS? That is going to be different for every program. So you should look for all the programs that you want to apply to and see what their deadlines are. December 1st is a common deadline, but I have no idea, what might be different places. Writing sample. Is it better to submit an entire paper from a seminar or an extract from a thesis? Good question. Whatever is your best work, whatever you think is going to be the most impressive is what I can tell you. And that could be a different answer for either of those things. If the program you're applying to has kept GREs optional and you had a bad GRE score, should you skip sending GRE scores? I mean, if GRE scores are optional and you are confident that your GRE score will not help your application, then I cannot think of a reason you would send it, is the only answer I can give you. And, to reiterate my previous answer, which is that I can't tell you that this is going to be for sure how it works everywhere, but not sending a GRE score if it's optional should not mean it should be nothing. It should just be a non-signal. And I can tell you that's how it is for our program. Need advice related to concluding your SOP for a PhD application in chemical engineering. Like I said, the most common conclusion for a statement of purpose is why that program. How to deal with anxiousness while applying and waiting results. Oh, that's tough. see, I hope you have a good support system. And I would recommend sort of finding someone that you think they don't have to understand completely, but at least be sympathetic, like to talk through some of your anxieties with. And just, I mean, it's not like I can, I can tell you like try not to think about it or whatever. Like it's, I know that that's not going to happen. I mean, I can tell you things that will not help. Going and hanging out on like the grad admissions subreddit and trying to figure out what all the acceptance rates are at every university and like drive yourself crazy, like trying to see whether people have heard back from the that's not going to help. It's going to make you feel worse. It's going to increase your anxiety. There's nothing there that will help you. Like that, like once you have submitted your application and all you can do is wait, trying to figure out things like have other people started hearing back, like is not going to help you. And so I would encourage you to try to not obsess, because it's probably just going to make you feel worse. Um, so whatever you usually do to make yourself healthier, things that make you happy, things that distract you, and if you're in like a sort of PhD, like if you're really like if you're like excited now, like maybe like read some books in like your sort of research area and like maintain your enthusiasm and excitement, but try not to obsess about whether you're going to get into any particular program because I mean I know this is hard to do and you probably can't even follow this advice, but like that's I that's what I would tell you to try to do at least. You did bad on your GREs and now colleges require it. How heavily might they weigh in your application? I can't answer this because it's going to be different everywhere. I can only tell you that it is entirely possible that for some programs they literally don't care. But I can't. I have no way to answer this for any particular program. I can just tell you that even when we required GRE scores, I did not care. Me personally. um Should you list a paper that you published a long time ago as an undergrad, or is it better not to list it? I mean, you should at least put it on your CV. I mean, my CV still has a paper that I published as an undergrad on it because it's a paper and I published it and it belongs on my CV. I mean, whether you want to like mention that like when you're talking about your research or whatever, I think I can't really answer that for you. Like, do you think it's relevant and helpful and all that? Average GPA in a BS and a good GPA in master's, 2 years of research. I can't, I'm afraid I can't answer this question for you at all. So anyone who gives me sort of like stats and asks me if they can get into a PhD program, I don't know. I'm sorry, but good luck. Is it usually okay to send TOEFL after the application deadline? So I don't know the answer to this. I was talking about this a little bit earlier when it came to like letters of recommendation and stuff, which is that like in my experience at least, we'll start looking at applications even if they're incomplete, which might include things like not having test scores yet. But I don't know if this is different. Like, I don't know, in some places they're like, oh, it's not done yet. We're not going to look at it. So this might be something where you should ask. Like, my scores aren't going to be in by the deadline. Is that okay? And I get questions like, so my email address is the one that's like there for people to ask questions about it, about the admissions process. And I get questions like that all the time. And so I've been able to tell people that like, I think for that. And sometimes I check with other people to see, like, because sometimes I don't know what things are like university level rules versus how we do stuff. But yeah, there should be someone who can answer that question for you. Is it okay to have a letter of recommendation from a teacher who's currently a PhD student? Yes. I mean, you should think of, so in general, you should think about like who's going to write the best letters for you. Earlier, I was talking about how like all things being equal, a letter from like a faculty member or like the PI of a lab is going to look slightly better than from a PhD student in the lab. but that if that PhD student is going to write you an amazingly glowing letter about what an awesome researcher you are and how you would be like the most amazing colleague as a PhD student, but the faculty member couldn't say anything about you, then like get it from the PhD student. So I think you should just think about who can write you the best letters. Um, Deadline is the 15th for an application. A professor is allowed to send their references for a few days after that. So I can tell you that for our program, it has been pretty common for applications to not have all of their letters in by the deadline. But I don't know if this is done differently in different places. Like we'll sort of start looking at applications and then go back later and see if there's more letters in. But if a program gets like a ton of applications, I don't know if maybe they don't do that. So I just don't know the answer to this, except like I think it's good to get them in as soon as possible by the deadline if possible. But like I wouldn't stress out about it if they're not in by the deadline. What are general timelines on getting and accepting offers? So this is going to be different. So just in my field, I start hearing some places start doing offers in like February or even earlier, depending on how fast they do things. Sometimes it's more like March, sometimes it's later. You're just not going to know. Uh, and then so one thing, uh, this might be a little bit different if you're applying in to PhD programs in countries outside the US, this is going to be different, but in the US, okay, I'm like 80% sure that what I'm about to say is true. um it could be that this is a disciplinary, but I can tell you that this is largely true, at least. There's a what is it? What's the date? April 15th. Programs, again, like I think this is true for most. I don't know if this is like a computer science thing, possibly, but I think this is generally true that like there's some date by which programs aren't allowed to require you to make a decision before that date. And I believe it's April 15th. And the reason for that existing, which is sort of a standardized thing across universities, is so that it's so because this would just be so, this is like dark patterns. Like this would just be such a bad thing to do. Like make decisions early and then tell people, oh, you have 2 weeks to decide, or you don't get an offer. In order to force people who haven't heard back from everywhere yet to come there. Like that would just be so bad. So this is why this rule exists, so that programs can't do that. Again, I don't know if everyone ascribes to that, but it's at least very common. So that that could be helpful. And if you start hearing back from places, you can like email other places and say, hey, I'm still really excited about your program. I am starting to get some other offers and need to make decisions, so I'm wondering when we might hear back. Just scrolled me down again. Hold on. Let's see. Working on a project that is going to be published by July. Is it advisable to list it on the CV as an ongoing project? So maybe not on a CV. Especially like if it's just a project, like it's not even a paper, like you haven't written a paper yet. I would say that doesn't go on your CV unless you want to have like you can have a section on your CV for like research experience. It has like the name of the lab or the name of the professor that you're working under or something like that. Or you could have a list. You could have a list for research projects. But what seems more likely here is that you'll talk about it in your statement of purpose, which is like totally appropriate and it doesn't matter when it's going to be published. Email the prof and added a link to your website. They haven't responded, but Google Analytics shows someone from that state. um, I would not read too much into this. That's all I'll say is I never read too much into any non-response. And in terms of like looking at your Google Analytics, I would not read too much into it. It's kind of all I can say there. When you're asked about your research experience for PhD, does the undergrad dissertation count as research experience? Yes, I would assume so. That definitely sounds like research experience to me. Um, Thoughts on the what else are you applying to field? What are the implications of this? Oh, okay. So this is a good question. And this is one of those things where I need to try. Like, I kind of want to ask around about how other I kind of want to ask around about how what people are actually doing with these. So I don't know. We don't ask this question. Um, but we will sometimes talk to people about this sort of later down the line. Um, so I can give you a sense of how that information might be used, but I don't think that there is any way in which it hurts you. That said, again, I don't actually know how places are using this information, but I don't think that it's used in any way that would hurt you. Um, I mean, we tend to try to find out about this not because of the application. Like, so, and okay, here's one possibility. It could be that that information is being asked for a reason that has absolutely nothing to do with whether you are admitted into the program or not. They might be asking that so that they can better calculate the odds that whether you will come if you're admitted. Now, and that shouldn't impact whether you're admitted, but it sometimes impacts how many students they admit overall. And this is like a really this is really complicated. Um so let me just talk about this a little bit. And none of what I'm about to say should give you any kind of anxiety. Like this none of this really has an impact on like your individual application. So you know, there are only so many spots for new PhD students, um, whether that's sort of per lab or per program or whatever. Um, and also, you are applying to lots of different places. I don't maybe not lots, maybe not all of you are applying to lots of different places, but you're probably applying to more than one program. And if you're not, I would encourage you to do that. Um, unless like you just absolutely know that you're that you're going to get in somewhere. Um, so when you admit students, not all of them are going to come. Um, like I would say, gosh, I'm ballparking here, but we get maybe like a little over 50% yield. Like, if we make 10 offers, 5 people come, something like that. But it also varies every year. So when you make offers, you might have like a guess for how likely people are to come, because like let's say you have spots for 8 students, um and you think that like these people have like a 90% chance of coming and these people have a 20% chance of, and so you end up like doing math for like, if you make this many offers to these people, here's how many students are likely to come. Like we've had a spreadsheet before where it's like, after we make these offers, we're going to have 8.25 students. And so knowing where else you applied can help them do that math. That there might be other reasons that people might ask that as well. But that's like why I tend to want to know that when we're like making decisions. Also, while I'm on this topic, the thing that I just described is also why wait lists often exist. Not everyone does wait lists, but a thing that might happen is that like if less people than they think are going to accept their offers end up actually accepting the offer, they might make more offers then, and so that's kind of why a wait list might exist. But I hope that's helpful. I don't think that information could be used against you in any way. We all know that people apply to more than one and they should apply to more than one program. Uh, so I don't see how that information could be used against you in any particular way. When you're asked about, oh wait, I already answered that one. Someone's exploring PhD possibilities, bachelor's and master's are in CS, and you want to do your PhD on robotics. Is that a disadvantage? Isn't robotics part of CS? um, I don't see how this would be like, are there even undergrad programs in robotics? I mean, honestly, if you said, I did my bachelor's and master's in biology and now I want to do a PhD in robotics, I would also tell you it was fine. But here, I can't even imagine how that could be a problem. um, in your undergrad thesis, you worked on signal processing and published work, but your current research and publications are different from your graduate research interests. Is this a problem? I do not think so. Especially if as an undergrad, you have sort of limited types of opportunities for research as an undergrad, right? Like it might be the lab that happens to accept you. It might be the projects that you get, like when I work with undergrad RAs, they don't get to like pick exactly what they do. do. I mean, unless I'm like advising a senior thesis. But if it's like, I want to be an RA in your lab, I'm like, here is a project that needs help. It might not be their passion, right? Because like they're not picking it. And so like having experience and understanding what research is still awesome, even if it's not in the same area. So I actually don't think that matters at all. But it would be nice if you sort of have a narrative for like, the types of things that you learned and how that might relate. Or you can just talk about it in terms of like, I did research in this area and I understand what research is, but here's what I'm really interested in now. You comment on the rate of applications submitted as GRE is waived. Are those two things related? I would not have thought of those two things being related. If they are related, like, are people submitting more applications now that they don't have to take the GRE? My only comment on that would be good. Like if the GRE is what was keeping people from deciding to apply to PhD programs, then I think like mission accomplished. Like that's kind of one of the reasons why I thought that the GRE was garbage, because it might be convincing people not to apply when they might otherwise be applying. If labs have rotations, what's the best way to address faculty of interest and statement of purpose? I'm not sure. I might not be understanding your question, but I don't think this would be any different from how anyone else would mention faculty in the statement of purpose. Because in your statement of purpose, you're probably mentioning more than one faculty member, more than one lab. And so it actually seems then that would be a benefit if there's rotations, because that means you're going to get to yeah. So I might not be understanding the question, but I think the answer is it would be the same, I think. How likely is it for one to get into a PhD without contacting a professor in that department? Perfectly likely. And in some disciplines, completely likely, because in some disciplines, it's not even common. Should you still try to apply to a program if you haven't heard back and you're only there for one specific prof? Yes, with a caveat. So yes, in that, as I've said, I think even like a number of times here, like don't read too much and not hearing back from faculty. Don't take it too personally if you don't get a glowingly enthusiastic response. They're probably just waiting to see your application. That said, I understand that that application fees are a thing. And so I don't want to like tell people that, oh, you should definitely apply I understand why you might be making decisions about how many places you can apply based on where, and so the answer is it could mean nothing, in which case, yes, you should still apply there. But I also understand why you might want to take that into account in deciding where to apply. So I can't really answer this for you except to say that you shouldn't assume that you're not going to be admitted because you haven't heard back from someone. Would you advise students without a research background to apply for a master's before a PhD? Oh, this is a really good question. As I said earlier on the stream, I have a couple of PhD advisees who didn't really have research experience when they were admitted into our program, at least what one might consider sort of traditional research experience. So it is not impossible to get into a PhD program without any research experience. That said, that is one of the things that certainly makes your application better. Um, and one of my YouTube videos is like what to do if you're rejected from every PhD program that you apply to. And one of the things I said is that like if it's possible that one of the reasons is that you weren't quite ready yet, or you didn't have research experience or this sort of thing, particularly if you're applying to very top tier places, then getting a master's degree can really help with that. There are a number of reasons why getting a master's degree can make your application stronger. It's not by virtue of having a master's degree. It's because of the things you do in the master's degree, which means you're probably doing more research and you're getting to know faculty better because grad classes tend to be smaller, et cetera. And they can, so like having more research experience and having better letters of recommendation are a thing that come along with having a master's degree. That said, a thing that you might consider is applying to some some of your top choice PhD programs, and then also applying to some master's programs. Like you could do that as well. There are lots of reasons why people don't want to get master's degrees, including the fact that they tend to cost money, in a way that PhD programs don't. And so, yeah. Does C Boulder follow a central admission system? I'm not sure what that means. Like, do you mean so I don't know what that means. All I can tell you is that like, the place where you apply, like the portal or whatever, I think is the same. It's all at the university level. And then in my department, I can go see everyone who submitted an application for us. If you're asking like, is someone in like a university admissions office making decisions about who gets into our PhD program? The answer is no. And beyond our program, I don't know anything else. What's the difference in whether waiving or not waiving your rights to see the reference letters? You probably should waive. I don't think I've ever, and the reason I say this is because I have never submitted a reference letter where the person has not waived the right to see it. That is absolutely the norm. And so unless there's some reason, I would, I can't, probably just waive it, all things being equal, because that's definitely like what the vast majority of people do. You have something 52% graduation, 65% in master's. Would you be able to do a PhD in English literature in the UK? So I can't answer that because I don't know anything about PhDs in English literature in the UK. I also don't know what those percentages mean. But also in general, as I've said, I can't tell you anything about whether you're likely to get into any particular program given any particular stats. Please talk about my program. So I assume, and you say you like looked at some of my papers and it's related to ethics. Job scope outside academics. Okay, so I will take just a few minutes to tell you about by my program. I assume you mean the PhD in information science at University of Colorado Boulder, which is not about ethics. Ethics is what I do. That's not even all of what I do. But information science as a discipline is a really sort of like interdisciplinary space that has a lot to do with like the intersection of people and technology and data. A lot of the faculty in our department are human-computer interaction researchers. Some of them are data scientists. Some of them are social scientists. There's a huge variety of different kinds of work. There's a big chunk of us who are basically social computing HCI researchers, people who study the internet. And outside academia, graduates of our program would typically go work in the tech industry. So my first graduated PhD student is a researcher at Facebook. We had a student who graduated last year who works at Spotify. So Yeah, I think if any of you are interested in information science, like a thing to know is that information science looks really, really different in different departments because there's like information science that's more like library science, and then there's information science that's more like computer science, and that's really kind of an important thing to know depending on which one of those you're more interested in. Didn't do good in the GRE and it's required for the program you're applying to. How heavily will it weigh? I absolutely can't tell you that. Again, all I can tell you is that for some people it doesn't matter, but I can't, but some places it might matter a lot. It's really hard to say. Is there any advantage to submitting your application months ahead of time? So probably not. I don't know if any programs do rolling admissions, but it seems like if they did rolling admissions, they would say that. I can tell you that in our program, we don't even look at applications until the day after the deadline. Like, I have no idea how many people have already submitted. I have not looked at their applications, and I will not look at anyone's applications until the day after the deadline. um, If you're interested in faculty from different departments, is it okay to mention them in your SOP when you're applying to one department? Ooh, okay, this is a really good question because someone asked me a question about this maybe it was on a video or something recently, and this like worried me a little bit. So let me talk about this for a minute. Okay, so sometimes there are departments that are quite closely related at a university. So like I was talking earlier about how like if you apply to our program in information science and the only faculty that you mentioned in your statement of purpose were computer science professors, even if they were affiliate faculty in our department, that would still look a little odd because it would be like, why didn't you apply to the computer science PhD program if everyone you want to work with is in computer science? That said, sometimes, but I mentioned affiliate faculty. So, for example, someone could apply to the computer science PhD program at my university and say they want to work with me. And that would actually be appropriate because I am an affiliate faculty member with computer science, which means I can advise PhD students in that program. I don't think I would ever do that because honestly, anyone who wanted to work with me like should probably be in information science. Anyway, nobody cares. So the question is, are you mentioning people in your statement of purpose because they could potentially be advisors? In which case, they need to be people who could actually be your advisor. And that is probably, for the most part, that's probably faculty in that department or affiliate courtesy faculty if that's a thing that exists. So that's something that you should figure out. But if you're going to mention a faculty member who's in a completely different department and unaffiliated with the program that you're applying to, you should make it very clear that you're not mentioning that person because you think they can be your advisor. You're mentioning that person because you want to, say something about how excited you are for connections across campus and that like make it very clear that you're not implying you think that person can be your advisor, if that makes sense. Because like we've gotten applications to our program before where their statement of purpose will like mention someone who's completely unaffiliated with our program, and it seems like they want that person to be their advisor, and I'm like, oh, well, that wouldn't be possible. So this would be something to figure out. Please make a video on a writing sample. There's actually, so I actually don't have, so what I would say about a writing sample, I can just tell you in 30 seconds. So it wouldn't really be worth making a video, which is that if a writing sample is required or optional, like what is your best example of work that you wrote? So for example, and so the only thing that I would suggest being like cautious of here is if you have, say, a published paper where you're in the squishy middle of the author order, like let's say you're third author on a paper and you submit that as your writing sample, you should make it clear somehow, somewhere in that application, like whether you wrote it. Like, because usually if someone's a third author on a paper, they did not write that paper. They like contributed to the data analysis or something, right? And so unless that's specified that you had a very heavy hand in writing that paper, I would assume that you did not and therefore that would not be a good writing sample. It should be something that it's clear that you wrote it. So that could be, a paper where you were the first author, or where you can say that you wrote a lot of it, or a paper for a class, or an undergrad thesis or something like that. How do you choose a good advisor? I suppose you get a mean one. What do you do? So I have a video on choosing advisors. Choosing advisors is not, something that you don't have to worry about as much until you have options. And so one of the things that's in that video is like questions that you can ask. But one of the things that you should, if you've been accepted into a program and you're deciding between multiple programs, or multiple advisors in the same program, like the best source of information are advisees of that person. But I also have suggestions in that video for like questions that you might ask to sort of try to figure out whether someone would be a good advisor or not. What question can you ask in a second round committee interview? I don't know. I mean, I guess it kind of depends in part of like what came up at the first interview. I mean, I guess, good questions to ask can be, gosh, I don't know. It's going to be, my first question would be, what questions do you have? Right? Like what questions do you have would be, one way to think about it. And I guess if you're just trying to like, if you're trying to figure out like a question that would make you look good, that's kind of hard to do. Um, I mean, if you're talking to a particular faculty member, or like a couple, maybe like something like, what's the research that's happening right now that you find the most exciting, can be a nice kind of question. Um, you might ask something like, um, I like maybe something about the research style, like is collaboration common in this department? Something like that. But yeah, it's going to be a little bit different depending on the situation. You wrote an honors thesis. Would it be a good idea to explain specifically what you did, or just the things you learned from doing it? You want them to know that you know what you researched. I mean, I think you talking about your thesis would be great. Um, I mean, in terms of like what you did versus what you learned, those things feel like they kind of go together for me. Is it too late to contact potential advisors? And what about a few days after submitting? So, this was something that came up actually at the very beginning of this stream, when I was talking about like, oh, we're pretty close to the deadlines. At least, again, December 1st is not the only deadline, but it's just a common one. A challenge if you are applying to if you're applying to PhD programs in the U.S., a challenge right now is that it's a holiday, or rather next week is a holiday. Like, not for all universities, but mine, we have the entire week off. So there's no classes. A lot of people are traveling. I'm not traveling, but just sort of for my mental health, I'm going to try not to work much next week, and so I will probably not be answering emails unless they are urgent. So that so the main reason I'm saying this is because when you say, is it too late? Like, again, like contacting potential advisors is a little bit of like a fact finding mission. It's something that can be helpful for you, but isn't necessarily like a thing that you have to do to be admitted. It is much more likely that you won't hear back than it would have been a couple of weeks ago. And that's not just because it's like close to the deadline, but it's because it's a holiday. And it's very reasonable that people would not be answering emails. So I just, if you decide to reach out, which you absolutely still can, you might add something like, I understand that you may not have a chance to respond to this before the deadline, but I would still be happy, if to talk to you, or like if you have questions, they might still answer them even if the deadline's passed. So, I guess the question is also in part like, why are you reaching out? Like, do you have questions? In which case you can ask them, and them answering them after the deadline might still be fine. Finding it difficult for how to begin your personal statement, what would you recommend in terms of structure or a hook? They're just so different for everyone. This is hard to give advice on. Like I was saying earlier, they sometimes look a bit like a funnel. like big picture first and then often end with like why this particular program. And so, the, I wouldn't worry. I wouldn't stress too much about like the perfect narrative hook. Like you don't need to feel like you've I don't know, like you need to start with some interesting story from your life or something. I wouldn't stress too much about that. Um so but it's tends to be kind of common to start sort of big picture is sort of the advice that I can give, I guess. Does it matter who is giving the letter of recommendation? Oh, uh-oh. Oh my gosh. Okay, I should probably give myself oh, there's 65 people here. All right, I'm gonna keep talking for a while. Usually, I only try to go an hour and a half. I'll keep talking for a while. Okay. Sorry, I scrolled down and I lost my place again. Oh, who's giving letters of recommendation? So this is something that I talk about in my letter of recommendation video, but, the question, like, is like, is it better to have, like, a name or something? You mentioned H index. God, I can't even imagine someone going and looking at the H index of someone who's writing a letter of recommendation, so I'll say that first. But in terms of, like, is it better to have someone who's a name? My answer would be who is going to write you the best letter? And let me give you a specific example. Let's say that there is a professor at your university who is like the luminary in your like they wrote the textbook for your field. They are like the most impressive person you can possibly think of, and you took a class with them. It was a 300-person class, and you asked them to write you a letter of recommendation, and for some reason they say yes, even though in this situation they should not say yes. But their letter of recommendation says, "This person took my class. Here is what my class is. They made an A in this class." And that's the letter. And I've seen this kind of letter before. Um, Useless, completely useless. Like, not like you might as well have not had a letter at all. Uh, um, so if your choice is between someone impressive who's going to write you a not useful letter and someone who's not as impressive who's going to say the most amazing things about you, then obviously go with the less impressive person. I mean, I say that, I sometimes say these things and then I'm like, but are other people far more elitist than I am? And the answer might be yes. But I still think that a letter that says nothing but this person got an A in my class, it's not going to be useful in any sense. Is having a paper as fourth author count? So it depends on what you mean by count. Like, if you were fourth author on a paper, that means that you contributed to that paper in some way, which means you have some kind of research experience. So that is something that you can talk about in your statement of purpose. For example, the fact that it resulted in a paper where you're fourth author, to me personally, is not that important. But it's good. That's great. And it goes on your CV. And you should talk about the work that you did. Does a bad TOEFL score look bad on an application? So I don't know what bad means. All I can tell you is that I actually, so for what it's worth, as the person in our department who spends more time looking at applications than anyone else, I do not know what is a bad TOEFL score. I don't know what is a good TOEFL score. I actually have never looked to see like what would be good or bad. I'm sure other people in our department have, if this has like come up before. I just personally have never looked. That said, my university has a minimum TOEFL score. Is that how you say that? Do people say TOEFL? Did they say anyway? My university has a minimum TOEFL score. It's listed on the application. My department did not pick that. It is a university-wide requirement. We have no control over it. And so if there's a minimum, you might ask them, and if you don't meet that minimum, you might ask them if this is actually a requirement or not. Because I got this question and I checked, and it turns out it's actually a university-wide requirement that we do not have the ability to waive. So you can find that out. How will talking about a weakness in grades affect your application? They asked to include an explanation. Well, I mean, I guess I mean, this is hard. I guess it depends on what the explanation is. I personally don't think you should be required to do that, but whatever. Um, it's so I, I don't know how to answer this. I would hope that again, weaknesses can always be made up for by strengths. A low GPA is not an absolute deal breaker for a PhD program, but especially if I mean, examples of reasons that I think would like not look bad at all would be like, oh, like something bad happened to you would be one. But I also don't think you should be required to like disclose that something bad happened to you. So I feel a little weird about that. But another example would be like, um, you know, I I used to be in this major and I hated it. And then I changed to this major and it was amazing. And look how much my GPA went up. So like one thing is that like an upward trajectory in grades often looks good, but also like there was a pandemic, so like that's a really good reason. So I wouldn't stress about it too much. Your grades are only one part of your application. Second thoughts about applying for a PhD program. You want to do research but feel discouraged when you see how much others have accomplished. Well, welcome to imposter syndrome. Everyone has it, and yes, it starts even before you get into a PhD program. Um, so so no, you're not crazy. So I can say that. No, you're not crazy. I'm guessing that the vast majority of the 60 people here right now feel the same way. Um, and you never know. And if it doesn't work out, a thing that you might consider is, things that you could do to improve your application or to do research in a context that's not getting a P. Like, I don't know if you already have a master's degree, but that would be another context in which you could, do more research. But no, you're not crazy, and everyone has imposter syndrome. And honestly, you're right on your way to being a PhD student because everyone in their PhD feels the same way. You have a gap of 11 years since your last program with work experience, and you want to go back for a PhD. Having work experience is not a bad thing, and I do not. Actually, here your second part here. You're afraid that they would think you'd rather keep working than occupy a research seat. Um, you are the one who can make that case. Why do you want to be a researcher now? Why do you want to do that instead of what you're doing now? Like you are the one to make that case. And I don't know what that case is, but I'm guessing that if you're this passionate about getting a PhD, then you can make it. Emailing professors for the last 3 months, but rejected from all because of your undergrad GPA. Wait, the professors rejected you in an email? That's weird. That's not emailing a professor is not an application. Okay. When you say they rejected you, do you mean they didn't respond? Do you mean like did a professor write you back and say, "Do not bother to apply to our program because your GPA is too low"? Is that a thing people do? I would find that strange. So I'm gonna ignore the part about like professors rejecting you because I don't understand how that works. But I, yeah, so sorry. Back to like the main point, like strengths can always make up for weaknesses. Yes. So I don't think that especially if you've done a master's degree, I don't see why your undergrad GPA would even matter that much. I might wonder about some of these responses you're getting. But yes, strengths can definitely make up for weaknesses. A top university says PhD applicants are not to contact potential advisors until you're admitted. Is this unusual? I don't tend to like see that as an explicit rule, but that's helpful. Like if that's a thing, like if the professors don't want to hear from students before the application deadline, then I'm glad they like told people that. So yes, it's probably a bit unusual. I don't tend to just see that as a rule, but that's good. Saved you some time. One of the universities asked to list relevant projects. Does teaching experience in the field count or just research? Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I suspect they mostly mean research when they say that. However, teaching experience in the field is like a thing that I think is relevant. So I think you might as well. I suspect they mostly mean research, but I think you could mention that. Do you think faculty enjoy the PhD admissions process? You hear stories like faculty have hundreds of applications, and they find reading SOPs tiresome. Um, PhD admissions, with one exception of one thing, is one of my is like probably my favorite service obligation of my job. Um, I've been running PhD admissions in our department since we started, and the reason that happened is because I volunteered in our very first year, and I keep doing it, even though I'm sure if I said I didn't want to do that anymore, that like other people would be happy to take it over. Um, I like reading people's PhD applications is like one of my favorite things. I love like imagining possible futures, and also knowing that like a large number of the people who apply, even the ones who don't get into our program, are going to go somewhere else and like do amazing things, and thinking anyway, I love it. The part that I don't like about it is not being able to admit everyone, and honestly sometimes it can be actually upsetting. Like I really dislike having to reject people and that sort of thing. But there's nothing that can be done about that. I don't know how other people feel about this. It's just me. um if a program asks for a writing sample, would a paper project for a course be sufficient if no publications? Yep, totally. Anything that you wrote that you think is a good example of your writing. What happens during the interview process post applying? Are they general questions related to the program research area, or are they technical questions? So, as I said in my video about PhD interviews, I don't actually know anything about PhD interviews. We don't do anything that looks like a formal interview in my department, and I don't even think that's like a typical thing in my field. So when I talk about interviews in that video, it's about like conversations that you're having with faculty or other people who have decision-making power over your application. Um, but it's not necessarily like a formal interview. Um, and they tend to be, in my experience, so that video, so if you haven't seen it, it might help answer this question, but also it's sort of like the things that you might get asked and how you should talk about things and the kinds of things that potential advisors want to see in applicants. That said, I have heard like people have commented on my videos and talked about getting technical questions. I can't even imagine that. Like, that's just like, that seems really weird to me, but I guess that's a thing that might make sense in a particularly like technical field where having like a particular kind of background knowledge would be critical for that program. So I guess I don't actually have an answer to this question, except maybe that's the thing that happens. I just don't know anything about it. Article was cited in a newspaper and you're invited to a podcast. How should that be in your CV? Oh, cool. I have a section on my CV for public scholarship, and it has op-eds that I've written, and I have a selected press section, which is like times that I've been mentioned in the news and that sort of thing. So media coverage, I think, is fine. Public scholarship is fine. I think either of those. Applied for the GRFP and listed it on your CV with application pending. This is the right way to approach this. So I think that's fine. I think actually mentioning it in your statement of purpose is better, though. I don't know how closely people look at CVs. But like the fact that you like took the initiative to go ahead and apply for the GRFP, and you can also say like the general thing, like area that you applied to do, like absolutely mention. I would say you should mention that in your statement of purpose. Emailed a prof and gave me background info, and that students aren't tied to an advisor after year one. How should you email other faculty since you know you won't be admitted to a particular group? Well, I guess my question would be like what do you like, what do you want to know from faculty? Like, why are you emailing them? And so then that would be the question. Um, so the only like sometimes like the reason that people email prospective faculty is just to ask if they're going to be taking new students, and maybe here it's not actually relevant, in which case do you want to know like what kind of research they're working on, or that sort of thing, in which case whatever it is that you want to know, that's what you should ask. How would you evaluate a student who's currently in a master's program, finished their coursework, but haven't started a thesis? The same way that I would evaluate anyone else. Yeah, I'm not sure that I understand this question. I mean, yeah, so is the issue like you haven't done any research at all yet? In which case, same answer to like anyone who doesn't have research experience, which is like make sure that you show why you want to do it and this is what you want to do and what kinds of stuff you're interested in and that you understand what research is, etc. How would you evaluate an international student? Oh, it's the same question. Oh, except for international, and the answer is exactly the same. International students, in my experience, are evaluated exactly the same as domestic students. Should you submit the GRE if optional? If you have GRE scores and you believe that score improves your application, then you should submit it, and if not, then you should not. And if you do not submit a GRE score, that should not be taken as meaning anything. If you're rejected from everywhere you apply to, would professors be exhausted by being asked to resubmit LORs? Oh God, I would hope not. I would hope not. I mean, it should be easy because they've already written one. But if there's anything you've done in the past year that you think improves your application, make sure that you mention that in case like there's anything you think they should update. When mentioning faculty in the SOP, is it all right to address their recent publications and interesting points and how these have influenced applications? I mean, sure. Like if there's a particular recent publication that's like a big, like, sure. I don't tend to see like specific publications reference, and that's in part just because like that's a lot of like if you're mentioning 3 faculty and you're gonna like mention a specific publication for each of them, that's like half your statement of purpose, and you should be spending more time on other things. It's more common to talk about sort of research areas than like particular publications. That said, if you're like reaching out like to talk to specific potential advisors like via email or whatever, then mentioning a recent publication makes a lot of sense. So I don't think this is bad. I wouldn't like spend half of your statement of purpose doing that. Do you ever do research into patentability or other law-leaning ethics issues in tech? Patents, no. Law-leaning ethics issues, yes. So I don't know if you're asking this because you already know this or not, but I have a law degree from before my PhD, and my dissertation was about copyright. I don't do a lot of law-related stuff now, though, because I don't have any PhD students who have any interest in law. GRE question again, answered that one. Is it critical to have experience in material science and quantum mechanics as you're applying to astro? I don't know. I don't know. This would be a question for someone in your field. If a writing sample were requested, would a legal memorandum be acceptable, or an older work product that's more similar to a traditional thesis? I mean, I guess that means maybe like what you mean by legal memorandum. I mean, I like for writing samples, I tend to think just like what's an actual good example of your writing, and that it's something that you wrote, like closest to like what sort of research writing in that field might look like would be best. But like if it's a legal memorandum about, I mean, I'm thinking like I don't remember if my PhD application had a writing sample, but if it did, I absolutely would have submitted a law review note. So, how? Oh, and it's just scrolled me away again. All right, here it's 11:42. So I'm gonna go until noon, and then if there are questions left, I'm gonna have to stop. I do need to like do other things with my day. Okay. How critical is the order of co-authors on the paper? Your third author, and you wrote it because you all contributed the same. Oh, okay. So it is a thing sometimes that like there's a bunch of authors, but it really was a very equal contribution. Um, and you can explain that. Like in your statement of purpose, when you're talking about this research project, like you can say, here's what I did, and here's what it was, and here's what I did. And we published, we wrote a publication in which we contributed equally to the writing of the paper. I think you can explain that. Is fourth author worth working at? I'm afraid I don't quite understand this question. Like, do you mean, is it worth being part of a research project even if you're, only going to be fourth author? Or do you mean, I think that any research experience is helpful, and that if it's a project you're excited about, then it's always worth it. And again, I am of the opinion that like, especially pre-PhD, like in PhD application process, I don't actually care if someone has a publication or not. So like author order doesn't really matter. It's the work that you did. So I don't so so no, I don't think that like, oh no, I'm only going to be fourth author on the paper should mean that you shouldn't do something. I think you should think about the experience and what you're doing, and instead of the publication at the end. How would you go about contacting PhD students if you only had an email with the prof? Do people typically wait until they're admitted before reaching out to advisees? Oh, this is a good question. Yes, I would say it's more common to talk to, because like talking to current PhD students tends to be more of a trying to decide where to go thing than a trying to decide where to apply thing. That said, if there's some question that you have that could be answered by students that you need to know before you're applying or before you talk to faculty or whatever, then I think that you can certainly do that. And the same thing, email. How can you include in your personal statement that you're the co-author of a paper? Some applications ask you to state published papers. Well, in your statement of purpose, you should be talking, in part about your research experience, and so you should say what you did. And the fact that there's published, I always feel like I should caveat this. I will confess, I feel slightly differently about this than other people. There are absolutely professors and PhD programs where like they really like bean counting, and publications as a metric are like actually important. I don't think that, but other people do. So I just want to caveat that. But to me, the important thing is what you did and what the research project was. And so then, after you've talked about that, if you want to say, and this is a published paper in this place, then you should say that. Is it a good idea to mention your master's teaching experience? Does it matter in a PhD application? So different people would feel differently about this. For like research intensive PhD programs, sometimes they'll tell you that they really do. I mean, like when I was in the job market, I had like a senior faculty member somewhere tell me that like for my job applications, they weren't going to care that I had teaching experience, which like is not true. But anyway, sure. So I personally think especially if it's if it's like in the area that you're applying to, I actually think mentioning that you are a teaching assistant could be really nice, because it's not even, so you might be funded as a teaching experience in a teaching assistant in a PhD program. And honestly, sometimes they like need people who are good teachers. And so that might actually help. But even if they don't really care about that, and it's really more about research, then like if it's in your relevant, field, then like being able to teach something suggests that you understand it in a way that actually is useful for like research and communication as well. Um, how can you resume a PhD program that you left 8 years ago? I think you're going to need to talk to them about it. The reason that I say this is in part because sometimes for PhD programs, your classes start expiring after some number of years. I mean, it's usually like 10. But I would recommend, like, if you want to go back to a PhD program you were in, like, I think you should reach out to them and start a conversation about it. Um, Not from an English speaking country, but you had an undergrad degree. Do you need an IELTS score? Um, okay, so I mentioned this a little bit earlier. So first of all, as I mentioned earlier, I don't actually know off the top of my head what the minimum uh, English language score requirements are at my university, but you can look them up. I did, however, recently learn that there is a university-wide minimum that individual departments do not have control over. So I recommend that so first you should look and see what they are, because any application that you're applying to, it's going to tell you what the minimum is. And then you should if you are under that minimum, you should email someone and ask them if you should still submit your application. Bit confused about opening paragraph for your SOP. So like I was saying earlier, like it tends to look a little bit like a funnel, like sort of start big picture, then talk about your experience and what you're interested in, and end with why this particular program. But even that isn't like a rule. I've seen lots of different structures. And so, whatever makes sense for whatever you're writing about, but often it sort of starts big picture. Do you need to identify one lab where you're potentially interested to work, or should you stick with potential advisors, research areas, and interests? So often lab and advisor are the same. This is okay. I recognize that this is not always the case, though. Is it like there's more than one faculty in a lab? Then I think either. I think these are kind of equivalent, like talking about labs or talking about research, and so same sort of advice applies, I guess. If you've talked to a supervisor and discussed opportunities and research topics, and they're interested in having you as a student, can you still get rejected? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, cool. So probably. And the reason I say probably is because you don't know who else is applying. You don't know. Sometimes they don't know how many students can be accepted yet, because it might depend on funding or teaching assistant lines or whatever. Sometimes decisions are very tied to an individual faculty advisor, and sometimes they're made by a committee, and you just don't know. But what I can tell you is that this is incredibly promising, and good luck and congratulations. What's a good number of places to apply to? This is really difficult to answer because it's going to depend on how many places are appropriate for you to apply to and how many places you want to go. So, in terms of trying to narrow it down, one thing that you might think of is, if I was rejected from everywhere except for this one place, would I go there, or would I want to wait or try again or whatever? And so if you can't say yes to that answer, you shouldn't apply there. But in terms of how many you should apply to, like how many are actually good choices, is going to be very different. How many application fees you can afford is going to be really different. Which are the easiest low quality PhD programs? I don't know. I hope there aren't low quality ones, or I hope you wouldn't want to go to a low quality one. But I'll add one more thing, which is that if by low quality you mean like low in some ranking, like rankings don't matter. Is it okay to write at least one professor for each program and ask if they're going to need PhD students? Or does it look bad, annoying? It's pretty common to reach out to potential advisors. It's not annoying unless in your discipline this isn't a thing that people do, and you can always ask. But the worst thing they can do is, worst they can do is not reply. Which, by the way, don't take that personally. But the other thing they might do is reply and say, "Thanks for reaching out. I look forward to seeing your application," and then that's fine too. Also, people are just like saying thank you and you're welcome. I'm glad the videos are helpful. Um, I'm trying to get through the rest of these questions. Does experience as a committee member at a conference and student volunteer help to get accepted? That can only, I mean, it can only help. Like, so none of these things are gonna like, gonna be your like magic button to getting accepted. Um, but if you're already so sort of like embedded in the research community that you were like part of organizing a conference and you're like, that's awesome, talk about it. What to do if your recommender doesn't have an institutional email? I don't see why this would matter. Just whatever their email is what you should use. Do you think things like being department student government rep or club president will matter? I mean, that's not going to be like a big thing, but something that like demonstrates your leadership skills might be nice. I mean, I probably wouldn't like spend a paragraph talking about that in your statement of purpose, but like put it on your CV and you can and if it's like if it shows sort of like your engagement with your discipline, that could be a nice thing. Is it possible to showcase research, undergraduate research projects? Sorry, it scrolled me away again. What about ongoing papers? Yes, you should absolutely talk about your existing research experience. And if it's in a different topic or a different field, that's fine because you can talk about like, the kinds of stuff that you learned. But if it's really different, you just might want to spend more time talking about what you're interested in now. Applied to a program some years ago. Looking back, your SOP was weak, and now you feel more prepared. Do you think an old application caused any trouble? I find it highly unlikely that people would remember. So I don't know for sure, but if someone applied to our program, say 3 years ago, unless it's someone that I interacted with, I am almost certainly not gonna remember. PhD interview tomorrow. Quick tips. I have a whole video about PhD interviews that might be useful. 3.3 GPA. Do I think your GRE scores are negative? I don't know. I think I don't care about GRE scores. And I can't, again, I can't answer questions about like, here's my stats. Am I going to get into a particular place? Everyone has good things and bad things, and those will be weighed in different ways. Thoughts on who is the best possible candidate for you in terms of CPA? Do you mean GPA? I'm going to assume you mean GPA. GPA, I don't, doesn't tend to be that important personally for me. Research experience, I think, is great. I mean, even for me personally, I don't have any particular like, here's what I think makes the best application, because everyone has strengths and weaknesses and they're going to be different and mean different kinds of things. Like I had a PhD applicant a couple of years ago where like the thing that stood out the most about her application was that she was blogging. Yeah, like, I mean, it's just gonna be different. It's gonna be different for everyone. Should you put workshops on your CV? If you think it's helpful, a CV is one of those things where like there's not like rules about what goes on it. So you can put anything on it that you think is relevant and would be helpful, and you can take stuff off if you think it's not helpful, as long as it's not like, I mean, you don't like take off, something that has to be on there, like your undergrad degree or whatever. Working on an article for a publication independently and you're the only author. Yes, I don't know why you wouldn't talk about that. Seems like you're researching something, and that's good. If you were waitlisted last year, what are the odds of success reapplying this year? We have priority. Ooh, I don't know the answer to would you have priority, and my guess is probably not. But if you were waitlisted last year, that's a really good sign that I think you might have a good chance. So, yeah. PhD student versus PhD candidate. Oh, such a good question. I didn't know this when I started my PhD program, and I thought that PhD candidate was what everyone was. And I think I might have like put it in an email signature or something, and someone had to tell me that I was not a PhD candidate yet. Usually So I don't know if this is different for different programs, but usually candidate means you have passed your dissertation proposal. Usually you finish coursework by then, but I don't know that coursework is a requirement, but that's usually what it means, is that you're a student, and then after you pass your proposal, you're a candidate. You don't have any research experience, and the writing sample is your first since your undergrad research. Do you think I have a chance? So I can't answer any questions about does anyone have a chance, except you don't have to have research experience to have a chance. But then you say since your undergrad research, and now I'm wondering if you have undergrad research, doesn't that mean you have research experience? But not having research experience isn't not always a fatal flaw. Is it critical not to have relevant research experience, but just experience? I'm not sure I understand this question, except that to say again that like undergrads often have limited types of opportunities for research, and so it would be unusual if you like had been able to do like the exact thing already that you were wanting to do. Don't have in South America, it's very hard for research. Most of the time you fund your own projects. Even if you try, can you still be considered a good candidate? Yes, I would certainly hope so. And this is actually one of the reasons why I think that like, anyone who thinks you have to have a publication in order to get accepted into a PhD program, like this is exactly the problem, because not everyone has the opportunity, and it's just not fair. And also, as I've said before, like I've admitted PhD advisees to work with me who didn't have research experience, like formal research experience before. And I think that is absolutely possible. Will this live be saved as a video? Yes, they all get saved as videos, and they don't get a ton of views afterwards, but a couple of people will like watch them all the way through, which like if you're watching this later and you've watched this video all the way through, hi. What's the timeline to follow up on an unanswered email? At least a week, and then do not follow up again. One follow-up is appropriate. Also, don't take it personally if you don't hear back. Don't read too much into it. Have I answered any questions about GRE importance? Yes, many, but I don't mind. I don't expect everyone to sit here through this entire thing. I am of the opinion that GREs are a useless signal, and I didn't care about them even when we required them. That said, other people feel differently, other programs feel differently. But one of the questions I got before was if the GRE scores are optional, is it okay to not submit them? And the answer is yes. I think that if you take the GRE and it's optional, you should submit it if it's helpful and not submit it if it's not helpful. And if it's required, the answer to how much does it matter is going to vary from program to program. How does the admission committee look at applications from someone with a disability? Okay, so this is actually a really important question that is tricky. One of the things, so first of all, I would like to think that it certainly would not have a negative impact. However, another thing that I'll mention is that like, I was talking earlier about diversity statements. And one of the reasons why I like talking about this kind of thing, like it might suggest a type of overcoming adversity that can be impressive. Also, sometimes universities and programs, et cetera, have like scholarships and funding and that sort of thing for students from underrepresented groups or first-gen students or students with disabilities and these kinds of things. So first of all, I would like to say, I would certainly like to think that this would not be negatively considered. I also think that it is up to you and your level of comfort whether you want to disclose that you have a disability or not. And it is even possible that it might open up scholarships or something. Not always, and I don't know that for sure. But I think that it's completely like your level of comfort in terms of whether you want to disclose that or not. But I would certainly like to think that it would not work against you. Mailed a professor so many times and didn't get a reply. Don't worry about it. Don't read too much into it. Could literally mean nothing. Low GPA. Would it be too much of a reach to apply to the Ivies? I have no idea. Also, don't assume that the Ivies are like always the best programs. And I'm not just saying that because I'm not at an IB. um, uh, someone's interested in information science, rate my chance. I can't rate your chance any more than I can rate anyone else's chance. Also, I don't know anything about you, except I will give you the same chance. I will tell you that everyone has a chance, right? That that's I would like to think that everyone has a chance. Moving to the U.S. with your husband and kids for your PhD. So you mentioned that since it shows how serious you are. I don't know. I mean, I don't know that this needs to be like in in your statement of purpose. It might be something that you would like mention to someone during an interview. I mean, if you want to, like if you think it's relevant, in a sort of like, I'm really ready. I'm going to pick up my family. And I think you can. I don't think you have to. Any part of an SOP that touched me that I still remember. Do we care about emotional? Or do we mostly look at what? Oh my gosh, I don't. I don't know if I actually remember anything specifically, but I was talking a little bit ago about diversity statements, and I remember I've I've gotten a couple of I've read a couple of statements of purpose over the years that, particularly because like information science, this is just sort of interdisciplinary field where there's been, someone has told a story about how like, as a woman, as a queer person, as a Black woman, I felt like computing was not for me. I never saw myself in this field, but I've started doing research, and now like those kinds of stories are lovely. Not everyone has a story like that, but I do, sometimes remember that kind of thing, or that sort of thing, or like very personal connections to the kind of research that you're interested in. Like I remember one applicant who was interested in like accessibility research, mentioning how like a family member had a disability. You don't have to have that you absolutely don't have to have that kind of story. I mean, they stick out in my head, but that's not like the thing that, makes someone get into the program, but it is where, it does stick out in my head, but everyone thinks they have to have a story like that in order for it to be a good application. Strongly recommended next to GRE means they're putting serious weight on it. I have absolutely no idea. What do you expect to see in a good personal statement? I have a whole video about statements of purpose. It's like, here's 5 things you should do in a statement of purpose, with the caveat that like you might want to ask people in your field too. Should you apply to the program where there's only one professor you're interested in working with? Yes, probably, with the caveat that like, they might change universities or get hit by a bus or what. Okay, they're not going to get hit by a bus, but like, I mean, if they're if you hate everyone else, probably not. That's not uncommon. Okay, there's 2 more questions here, and I'm going to answer these 2. And if anyone else asks a question, I'll answer it on. Go ask it in the comments of this video once it posts. Is it easy to get a job, a quant job in a hedge fund after a PhD in? Oh my god. I don't know. Why would I know that? I have absolutely no idea. Gosh, do hedge funds hire? I guess probably so. This is making me think of the character in Billions who didn't go to a PhD program and instead went to work for that the like venture capital or hedge fund or whatever instead. When using part of a master's thesis in your writing sample, would you put the thesis bibliography in there or not? Yes, it would be weird to not include references in something that has references. In SOP, should you write more about past research or future research? I mean, I guess that depends a little bit on how related they are, because if your past research is like completely unrelated, I might spend a little more time on your interests now. But I think it's going to vary from person to person. Okay, last question. How is master's SOP different from PhD SOP? Ooh, I gotta tell you, I'm not the best person to give advice on master's applications because we like barely have a master's program, and so I haven't spent a lot of time looking at applications or thinking about what makes a good one. But probably, especially if it's a professional master's, then like research is less important. But if it's a research master's, then it actually might look kind of similar to a PhD. Statement of purpose. All right, I'm gonna call it a day. um, okay. Well, let me answer this question. If there's no diversity statement, can you mention, like for example, being a queer person? Yes. If that's if especially if that's relevant to why, like, there are a lot of um, there are a lot of students and faculty in our department with various marginalized identities. Lots of queer people, lots of uh, women, people of color. And mentioning that, like, that's one of the reasons you're applying to that program, I think would be perfectly fine. For example, or as you say, some kind of diversity statement or whatever. Okay, let me keep going. One more. How do graduate admissions committees work? If you've talked to a particular faculty member, is it directly to them? Varies. Definitely varies. It would be unusual for a faculty member to make a decision completely on their own, but they often have an incredibly strong, like, because if it's a program where you're tied very closely to an incoming advisor, they might have a lot of input, but they're not making the decision like completely on their own. Okay. All right, I'm going to call that. If anyone else has any more questions, as soon as I stop this live, it will post this as a video on YouTube. And so go and leave your question in the comments there, and I will answer it. I think I also have a few unanswered questions on previous videos. So I'll check those out in the next couple of days as well. And finally, good luck if you are finishing up PhD applications right now. Then really good luck to all of you. And as I was saying earlier, once your application is submitted, there isn't a lot more that you can do at that point. So try to relax, find your social support, and try not to obsess. Don't like go constantly looking on Reddit to see if other people have gotten decisions back. Like it isn't going to help you. And also for those of you who are in the US, I hope you have a nice holiday next week. And feel free to leave questions on my videos if you have more. All right. Bye, everyone.